Good afternoon. I'm Emma GARCÍA, an economist with the Economic Policy Institute, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. I am in charge of the education research within the Economic Policy Institute. I am specialized in the economics of education and education policy. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation to participate at this symposium. I'm delighted to join the list of distinguished speakers and all of the participants. I want to especially thank Drs. Jun Yamashita and Yuka Uzuki for their invitation. I am going to provide a short overview of a report that examines learning and development during COVID-19, usually using evidence and data from before it, and addresses education policy after the pandemic. This is a joint report with my colleague, Dr. Elaine Weiss. I will just mention some of the lessons learned and our goals when the project started. For those of you interested, there's a lot more in the paper and in some forthcoming pieces, all available on EPI's website. Given what was going on and what was available, we felt it was critical to offer a shift from the field's more automatic question about how much children learn or about the test scores to a more important question at that time, which was what is happening to students, and to an even more important question after COVID, which is what do we need to do about it? What this means is that we wanted to move from outcomes, which often overlook at the drivers and are only available after the facts and never during, to inputs, to the processes and to the mechanisms that drive the outcomes, and from that to policy actions. Note that, for example, in the paper, we refer to interruptions and disruptions in children's learning and development. And we don't talk much on performance, outcomes, trends, or achievement gaps. For that, we conducted two different explorations. The first one was to check what pandemic relevant research would tell us about the learning and development happening this month. And second, to see how the pandemic and associated economic crises are playing out for various subgroups of children, and therefore what we know about disparities in opportunity during the pandemic. I am sure there's been a lot of discussion in Japan, as it's been in the US and in Spain, my country of origin, on the so-called remote learning and remote teaching on a homeschooling setting. We have all become familiar with terms like the digital divide, and by now understand that theory and practice were not so overlapping. In the report, we check what the requirements for effective remote education are, as well as how far a typical intentional, well-resourced homeschooling setup was from the reality for some of our students. We show that the assumption that these were going on smoothly was just not true, because some students don't have access to the necessary tools, some had no prior experience using them for homework. They had experience actually for using them for other purposes, such as leisure or social interactions, and multiple challenges can pop up when what economists call selection into some types of treatment is not found. Access to devices is critical when we are thinking about the provision of school education remotely. And the assumption that all children have been learning remotely is simply not true. Data for the US shows that 4% of students had no internet, 16% had no laptop or PC at home, and those shares were always consistently larger for low-income students. Teachers also lacked the training and the support needed to shift to online instruction overnight. Even now, teachers and principals are reporting on the extreme difficulties to something as easy as communicating with parents, since they used to rely on in-person communications. There are other areas of research that have received less attention, but that we find extremely helpful to lay out what to do next after revisiting its working mechanisms from the perspective of the pandemic. The evidence on learning time tells us that decisions about extending school schedules or calendars will have to ensure that instruction is of high quality, and that involves many things. That involves intensity, after-school activities that also support the development of the whole child and children's well-being and emotional health, to smaller class sizes, to having sufficient, highly credentialed staff who also get the right supports. That evidence, especially the one on summer learning, tells us that children learn very differently, which we will have to address by offering more personalized and flexible instruction. Research on chronic absenteeism reinforces the urgency of providing appropriate support to students who are least prepared and who are especially at risk of becoming disengaged and eventually dropping out. The United Nations has recently defined this as a potential generational catastrophe, with about 24 million learners at risk of not finding their way back to their studies after COVID-19. From the research on education in emergencies, we learned two main things. First, that contingency plans play a critical role mitigating the impacts of recessions, natural disasters, and pandemics on learning and development. And second, that there are large costs associated with reduced education spending that often follows an economic crisis. For this research, it was critical to illustrate how opportunity gaps are growing in the academic context, but we know that they are broader than academic. The larger digital divide among vulnerable subgroups I alluded to is just the tip of the iceberg. Indeed, and just as important, and as my EPI colleagues have shown, the same students are also more likely to have parents working a low-income frontline job, which means that either they lost a job and probably health insurance and are much more likely to be exposed to the virus, or parents are not available to provide support for remote learning. In our report, we talk about how these factors compound and exacerbate the opportunity gaps that various groups of children already experienced prior to COVID. Our policy recommendations are guided by these lessons. They seek to address the adverse impacts of COVID-19 on education and to rebuild stronger as we move forward. We offer three key pillars to reframe the education policy discussion, which we see as sequential, but also as interacting with one another. First, while the remote instruction continues, schools must get relief. That means they must get the resources and the supports needed for education to happen functionally while they remain closed or operating in hybrid mode. This could range from providing meals to buying tablets or laptops for every child in the district, or to ensuring access to internet. As schools begin to reopen, they must prioritize diagnostic assessments to identify where children are. We anticipate the need for more personalized learning, more intensive interventions, and increased attention to students and teachers' socio-emotional well-being. Given those priorities, school districts must implement strategies to retain highly credentialed teachers, especially those at higher risk of not returning because of the coronavirus. Finally, while this crisis poses enormous challenges, it also presents unique opportunities. Rebuilding provides a chance to finally do the things we should have done long ago. This pandemic has laid bare how stark inequities infect virtually every aspect of school life, as well as the dire consequences for our economies of allowing those inequities to persist. We thus urgently renew our call to redesign the public education system to focus on nurturing the whole child and on breaking the links between social class and education to ensure that all children have access to the conditions and resources that enhance learning and development. I want to emphasize, however, that if there is one more key critical finding revealed by this research, it's that education policy alone cannot ensure that all children have the foundation they need to get a good education. It is essential, but should be a part of a mosaic of public policies and economic policies that would tackle all the existing opportunity gaps. Arigato, thank you very much. This, you can see on this slide my contact information. I would be delighted to be in touch with you for questions, clarifications, or just for conversations about actions, interventions, and programs that will help all of our students. I'm also offering the link to the report that I just presented, as well as to some other companion shorter pieces that you may find interesting. Thank you very much.